In this recording, we're looking at the relationship between the money supply and prices. And what research has shown is that over long periods of time, if the money supply grows too quickly, then that can lead to excessive inflation. Now, I've got listed on this slide 3 ways in which the money supply can grow. The first is by the central bank printing paper money, excessive amounts of paper money. The second is through the credit creation process through the banking sector, and 3 is quantitative easing, QE. And all of these 3 ways in which the money supply can grow are quite distinct, but they all have the same relationship with the price level. That is, if the money supply grows too rapidly through any one of these 3 mechanisms, it can lead to excessive spending and therefore excessive inflation. So really the relationship between the money supply and inflation is obviously through spending. So if the money supply is growing too quickly, that can actually lead to excessive spending, and that will lead then to excessive rates of inflation. So what we're going to do before we start running through these 3 ways in which the money supply can actually grow is move on to the next slide and just remind ourselves that there are different measures of the money supply. So what I've got here is a fairly generic set of definitions of what M1, M0, M1, M2, M3 are, and also MB, the monetary base. A lot of people think of money as just notes and coins, but it's not. It's also bank account deposits. So we're going to keep it nice and simple and think of the money supply as either currency in circulation or bank deposits. Now there are obviously many different types of bank deposits, but we don't want to overly complicate this, so we'll just refer to money in the bank as bank deposits, and we'll ignore the definitions of M1, M2 and M3, etc., etc. Certainly read about them. They will help you understand that money is not just currency in circulation, because certainly money in the banking system is these days almost as liquid as cash. It's very easy to spend money in a savings account. It's very quick to do that. All you need to do is take out a credit card of some sort, make a purchase, and then go onto the internet and transfer the money from your savings account to your credit card account, and in that sense that money in a savings account is almost as liquid as cash. So the thing we need to keep in mind is strong growth in the money supply can lead to strong growth in aggregate demand, which can lead to strong inflation. So the whole aim of monetary policy is to try to limit the rate at which the money supply is growing. And one way that that can actually be done is through changing interest rates to control the money supply. Now that may not be clear at this stage, but we'll get to it and I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay, the first way of printing excessive amounts of money is by printing paper money. And that has occurred more so in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even in more recent decades, and in developing economies as well. So Germany is a classic example of printing excessive amounts of money in the 1920s and 30s. Zimbabwe more recently printed huge amounts of paper money and circulated that money. Now I've got a link there which will help you understand the link between the money supply and inflation from the St. Louis Fed, but to explain this relationship I'm going to look at the equation of exchange. And this equation of exchange, even though it's listed under number 1, it really does help you understand, or it should help you understand, how the credit creation process can also lead to inflation and how quantitative easing can also lead to inflation. So this equation is very fundamental and it shows the relationship between the money supply and the price level. So to explain this equation of exchange, I've put some numbers here, attached some numbers to each of the variables in that equation, and let's just imagine on the right hand side Y being real GDP, and we're measuring real GDP now in physical units of output. So let's just imagine we're dealing with an economy that produces nothing but Mars bars, chocolate bars, and this economy produces 250 chocolate bars in a year, nothing else. and the market price of those chocolate bars is $2 per chocolate bar. Now, the total value of GDP in that economy in 1 year is going to be $500. $2 times 250 units of output, $500 worth of GDP. Now, let's also assume that the money supply is 100. Now, velocity is whatever number makes that equation hold. Now, in this case, we have $500 worth of output, but our money supply is only $100. So effectively, that money supply needs to be used 5 times. It needs to turn over 5 times to purchase the value of GDP produced of $500. So the velocity is the number of times in a year that the money supply either turns over or is used. Different terminology for effectively the same thing. Okay, so how does this equation help us understand how printing excessive money creates high inflation, or excessive growth in bank deposits will also have a similar effect, but we'll learn about that a little bit later. Okay, so let's just imagine that we are in this economy with 250 Mars bars being produced, and the government comes along for some reason and doubles the money supply. Doesn't matter what the reason is, they just double the money supply. The question then becomes, what happens? Well, let's make a simplifying assumption and assume that the velocity stays the same. So the velocity is the number of times the money supply turns over, or the speed at which it turns over. So another way of interpreting the velocity of money is the speed at which people spend their money. So let's just imagine that the speed at which people spends money stays roughly constant. So if it takes you roughly 2 months to spend $1,000, then let's just keep that assumption constant. That's the speed at which you are spending money, $1,000 in 2 months. So that's the velocity in your personal example. So let's keep that constant. But now we've got the money supply doubling to 200. If that is the case, then that change in the money supply is going to show up somehow in terms of a change in the variables on the right-hand side. So either P needs to increase or Y needs to increase. And we know that an increase in the money supply will lead to either an increase in P or an increase in Y because of research in this area. People have taken very large time series of data, and they've done the tests on the data and found out that this is broadly true. So then the question is, well, if the velocity is constant at 5 through assumption, and that's a realistic enough assumption for now, and the money supply doubles, is that going to double the price level, or is it going to double the production of chocolate bars? Well, what determines the production of chocolate bars? It's going to be the amount of capital and the amount of labour that we have, the level of efficiency in production, and also the level of technology that we use to produce the chocolate bars. Now, simply by increasing the money supply, increasing more paper money in this example, because we are dealing with paper money in this example, that is not going to get you more capital or more labour or more technology or better efficiency. Simply by printing more paper, you can't increase the amount of capital or labour or technology you have. That needs either population growth or investments, additional investment spending in capital equipment, or more R&D for technology. So what's going to tend to happen is if we assume that the level of production, the 250 chocolate bars, stays the same, then this doubling in the money supply will mean that people will simply have more money. They will bid up the prices of these chocolate bars, and we can expect the price of chocolate bars to approximately double as well. So more money, more purchasing power, and you start bidding up prices in an economy. Now let's just imagine that the money supply now is not doubling, but not doubling in a year. Let's say it's doubling every day. Now that seems like an extreme example, but as you'll see from the next few slides that we'll go through in a little while, it's not an extreme example at all. That sort of thing has happened in the past. Let's just imagine the money supply is now doubling on average every day. What's going to happen? Well, initially, it will start fueling inflation. So the inflation rate will start rising and rising and rising and rising. So as we increase the money supply, if we're doubling the money supply every day, then the amount we are increasing the money supply by, in dollar terms, that's actually increasing in size. So that's going to fuel ever-increasing increases in the price level. So the price level may go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. It's that type of exponential growth in the inflation rate that we are talking about in this hypothetical example. So then what happens? We're doubling the money supply every day, and prices are going through the roof. We're experiencing massive inflation. Now, as this process of rapidly rising inflation takes off, people are going to realize that prices are increasing so rapidly that they can't afford to hold their money for as long as they were previously. They can't afford to wait a week until they make their next purchase of chocolate bars. So then what happens is, because of the high inflation, people don't waste a minute. As soon as they get their income, as soon as they get their hands on any money, they will spend it. And so then what happens? The speed at which people spend money increases. That then in turn increases the velocity of money. So now not only have we got the money supply increasing, we've got the velocity of money, the speed at which the money supply is turning over or being used, that increases. And so we've got both of these, both increases in M and V, channeling their way through to increases in the price level. So when you get big increases in the money supply, and the speed at which it is turning over increases as well, that's a recipe for massive inflation. So where has this sort of inflation happened around the world? Well, in Zimbabwe. So what I've got here is a picture right on the right hand side there. We've got a $10 Zimbabwean note, but they experienced a hyperinflation through excessive printing of paper money. And eventually $10 became worthless, $20 became worthless, even $50 became worthless. And so as the price level increased through this massive inflation, they had to increase the number of zeros on their banknotes. And the highest one here is $100 billion, but I've actually got one myself that is a $100 trillion Zimbabwean banknote. $100 trillion. So it's got an extra 3 zeros above and beyond that $100 billion note. So things can get out of control very, very quickly. Now, in this course, you need to understand that increases in the money supply like this can lead to inflation, and why. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to understand the full effects of very rapid inflation like this, but you certainly do have to know the costs of inflation. So, for example, this will involve shoe leather costs and menu costs, which you should have read about. So really just linking this very rapid inflation to the costs of inflation reading that you would have done is enough. Okay, and then we've got Zimbabwe's hyperinflation. So on the right hand column here we've got year on year or 12-month inflation, and you can see the height at the height of the hyperinflation in November 14, 2008, the inflation rate was some incredible number. I don't want to guess what that is, what that number is, but it's probably 89 billion trillion or something like that. I'll leave it to you to work out, or attach a name to that number. But you can see how the inflation rate started off at a relatively low 2,200% for a 12-month period, and then just exponentially accelerated. So the way you get that exponential acceleration in the inflation rate is the fact that the central bank, on behalf of the government who is printing the money, each time they print, they need to print a lot more than they did previously to stay ahead of the inflation. If they printed the same amount as they did last time, it would be worthless. So they have got to accelerate the rate at which they actually print new money. So if last week they printed 1 million, next week they've got to print 10 million. and then 100 million, and then a billion. It sort of increases exponentially like that. And then the other thing that's causing this acceleration is the massive increase in the velocity of money as well. Eventually what happened in Zimbabwe, the whole system broke down. No one was accepting Zimbabwean dollars anymore, and people went back to barter, and people actually traded in US dollars on the black market as well. Okay, so that's printing paper money. The second process that you need to read about and understand is the credit creation process through the banking sector. So what we have here is an initial new deposit of let's say 1 million guilders. Now, as that new deposit comes into the bank, it could be a deposit as a result of selling a bond to the central bank. As that new deposit of 100 guilders comes into the banking system, that is a liability for the bank because they owe that money to whichever customer deposited that money. Also, they would be paying interest on this deposit to the customer. Now, initially, the bank will then have assets in the form of currency equal to 1 million guilders, or as they call it in the banking system, that currency is called reserves. Now, in a lot of countries, banks will have to keep a certain percentage of their deposits as reserves, just in case customers come along and they want their money back. So let's just assume that the required reserve ratio is 10%, so the bank needs to keep 100,000 guilders as reserves, here in table 7.4, and then they are free to lend out the other 900,000 guilders. And they will lend that money out so that they can earn interest on that money, which they use to partly pay interest on the original deposit and partly to make a profit. So that 900 guilders is then loaned out. But in table 7.4 here, let's remember what we've got. We've got a $1 million deposit. And what we saw previously was that bank deposits are money. So we've got new money here of $1 million. But as this money is loaned out to farmers, let's assume that the farmer spends it on new equipment. And the seller of the equipment then deposits that $900,000 of income into the bank. Let's just imagine that the seller of the equipment paid for the equipment a long time ago. So that $900,000 is now money in the hands of the person selling the equipment to the farmer. That person selling the equipment, they also bank with this bank, so they actually put the money into the bank as a deposit. And now deposits have increased to 1.9 million guilders. So what's happening is the amount of deposits have gone up, so the money supply has gone up. And of course, then the effect on reserves is that reserves now go from 100,000 up to 1 million. That is, the original 100,000 plus the new 900,000 deposit gives us reserves of 900,000. Now, because deposits have increased by 900,000, the bank can then lend out 90% of that. So what they will then do is undertake another loan of 810,000 to another customer. That money will be spent by the person borrowing that 810,000. It will be earned by someone else, and the person who's earned that the 810,000 will deposit it back in the bank, the banking system. So the deposits at this bank will now be 2.71 million guilders. So the money's come back, the 810's come back. The bank will then have new excess reserves. They will lend those excess reserves out. That'll be a new loan, new spending. The money will come back into the banking system again. Now, this process is actually a little bit different from the creation of money by printing money back here. When central banks print money and that money is circulated into the economy, it's really the presence of excess money in the hands of individuals that prompts them to spend that money. So it's really the money which is driving the spending. Just imagine it yourself. Somehow there's more cash in the economy. The money supply, the physical money supply, paper money, has increased. That is going to somehow get into your hands. What are you then likely to do? You're likely to simply spend more of it because you have more of it. So in this example, the additional paper money fuels the spending, or the increase in the money supply fuels the spending. In this example, it's actually the other way around. It is the demand for loans which then creates spending, which creates additional income, which then creates new deposits into the banking system, which is new money. And I'll say that again. Here, it's not increases in the money supply driving increases in the desire to spend. In this example, number 2, it's actually the desire to spend money which is fueling increases in the money supply, which is the opposite to this example. Here, it was increases in the money supply fueling spending, fueling the desire to spend. Here, it is the desire to spend that is fueling increases in the money supply. And so I'll just explain why that's the case once more. In this example, the only way the money supply can be increased from, say, 1 million up to 1.9 million guilders is if someone borrows the $900,000 excess reserves. So someone has got to borrow that money with the desire to spend it. So the desire to spend comes first. The desire to borrow and spend comes first. Then that $900,000 is spent. It is earned by someone else, and then that person puts the additional $900,000 back into the banking system. And when that money comes back into the banking system, then you have new reserves. Then you have new deposits and new increase in the money supply. So it sort of works the other way around. Okay, so so this is very important, the credit creation process, because as the money supply grows through this credit creation process, it is actually a signal that there is more demand for loans, more demand for spending, and therefore more spending, which is going to fuel inflation. So very often central banks will monitor the total level of deposits in the banking system, in their economy, and if that growth rate in the money supply, if the growth rate in the total amount of deposits in the banking system is very strong, it's a sign that this credit creation process is very strong. And that can then be a sign that inflationary pressure may be building. Now, with this credit creation process, it can be slowed down by either increasing the required reserve ratio from, say, 10% up to 20%. That'll slow the whole process down, because instead of lending $900,000, this bank would only then be able to lend $800,000. The other way of slowing the process down is to increase the cash rate. If you increase the cash rate, it will increase retail interest rates. And if you raise the interest rate on this type of borrowing, that will decrease the demand for borrowing as well. So in that case, banks may not be able to lend out all of their excess reserves, and it will just slow this entire process down. So let's have a quick look then at the relationship between the money supply and the price level, just to convince ourselves that there is a strong relationship over time. So what I've got here is a time series of the inflation rate in the United States over a 45-year period. And you can see there's a lot of volatility there in the inflation rate. To get rid of the volatility, I have put a moving average through this series. So if I create a moving average, it looks like that. Then I add in the growth rate of M2. Now you can see year to year the correlation between the growth rate and the money supply and the inflation rate is not overly strong. But if you put a moving average through M2 as well, you get this. So what that shows us is that over the longer term, well, over the medium term, there's a very strong relationship between the growth rate in the money supply and the inflation rate, both measured as percentage changes. Both as variables are measured as percentage changes. So even though quarter by quarter, year by year, the correlation between those two series is not strong, over the medium term, there's no denying the very strong relationship between these two series. So if the money supply is allowed to grow out of control, then the inflation rate will get out of control. And we've learnt two ways so far that the money supply can get out of control in terms of growing too rapidly. First of all, it can be printed, and there's a range of countries that have done that, printed excessive amounts of money. The second one is by letting the credit creation process get out of control and cause growth in the money supply, which is too rapid. Okay, so just remember what I mentioned before. The direction of causality in those two sources of growth rates in the money supply are important. In the first one, the more paper money fuels spending. However, in the second one, the credit creation process, it's really the desire to spend which fuels increases in the money supply. Either way, the relationship between the money supply and spending is the money supply and inflation through spending is very strong. The final way the money supply can be increased is through quantitative easing. And we will do more work on quantitative easing later on in this topic, but just for now, quantitative easing basically involves the central bank creating electronic money and using that money to actually purchase financial assets. So it's literally, well, not quite literally this simple, but I'll just go through a very simple explanation of how money is printed using quantitative easing. When people say quantitative easing involves printing money, they don't mean printing paper money. In the United States, for example, the central bank after the GFC, in the years after the GFC, printed around about $3.5 trillion with QE. Now obviously they didn't produce $3.5 trillion of $100 notes, not the paper money. This is electronic money that is created. So even though people use the term printing money or printing new money with quantitative easing, this is electronic money. So with the central bank, they do have the power to actually create more of their own currency. And the central bank has a bank account. It has an account where it has holdings of its own currency. And it can go in, because it's the central bank, it controls the money supply in the domestic economy. It has the power to go into that account and add more money into that account if it wants to undertake quantitative easing. So in terms of a really simple example, if they want an additional $1 billion, they go into that bank account and just increase the balance by $1 billion. It's literally that simple for them. They can then use that additional $1 billion to inject that money into financial markets. Now, by creating new electronic money like this, when it's injected into financial markets, it will show up as increased bank balances of financial institutions in the banking system. But we know that money in bank accounts can be used to fuel lending and spending. So even money which is put into the banking system and lies in bank accounts, potentially if that money is loaned out or spent by the financial institution directly, it can have the effect of inflation. It can be very inflationary. So they're the three ways in which the money supply, or three of the main ways in which the money supply can be increased. And what I've tried to do is emphasize that strong growth in the money supply, regardless of the source, can have very powerful effects on overall spending and the price level.